August 1945, and the world was entering a new era. Two atomic bombs had ended the war in the Pacific. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins, and in the skies above Germany, RAF pilots were flying something that seemed to belong to a different universe than the propeller-driven fighters that had won the Battle of Britain. The Gloucester Meteor jet fighter was screaming through German airspace at speeds that would have been considered impossible just 5 years earlier. No propeller, no piston engine, just pure turbine power pushing the aircraft to 600 miles per hour. The future had arrived, and it was loud, fast, and revolutionary. Back in Britain, engineering teams were already drawing up plans for the next generation of jet fighters. The de Havilland Vampire, the Hawker Seahawk, advanced designs that would make the Meteor look primitive. Military planners were filing reports about the obsolescence of piston engine fighters. The propeller, they declared, was finished. Any air force that wanted to remain competitive in the post-war world would need to transition entirely to jets within 5 years. And there, sitting on airfields across Britain and the Mediterranean and the Far East, were thousands of Supermarine Spitfires. The aircraft that had saved Britain in 1940, that had fought through 6 years of war, that had been built in more variants and greater numbers than any other British fighter. Beautiful, elegant machines with their distinctive elliptical wings and Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Obsolete. That was the word appearing in Air Ministry planning documents. The Spitfire had done its job magnificently, but its time was over. The jet age had no room for a design that traced back to 1936. Start phasing them out. Begin scrapping the older marks. Transfer them to colonial air forces and training units. The Spitfire's war was over, except nobody told the Spitfire that it was obsolete, and over the next 15 years, this supposedly outdated fighter would serve in more conflicts, in more roles, and in more air forces than the jets that were meant to replace it. The Spitfire would fight in wars on 4 continents. It would shoot down jets in combat. It would set speed records. And it would remain in frontline service with some air forces until 1961, 16 years after jets supposedly made it irrelevant. This is the story of how a fighter designed in the 1930s refused to fade into history, how it evolved, adapted, and proved that sometimes the old ways aren't obsolete, they're just proven. The Spitfire that emerged from World War II in 1945 was a completely different aircraft than the one that had fought in 1940, even though they shared the same name and the same basic shape. The evolution of the design through the war years was so extensive that a pilot from 1940 would barely recognize the cockpit of a late-war Spitfire. The original Spitfire Mark I that fought in the Battle of Britain had a Merlin III engine producing 1,030 horsepower. It was armed with 8 303 machine guns, had a top speed of about 362 miles per hour, and could reach 20,000 feet in about 7.5 minutes. It was a brilliant dogfighter, beloved by pilots for its handling and responsiveness. By 1945, the Spitfire Mark XIV was powered by a Rolls-Royce Griffon 65 engine producing 2,050 horsepower, literally double the power of the original. It carried 2 20mm cannons and 4 303 machine guns, or in some configurations, 4 20mm cannons. Top speed was 448 miles per hour, and it could reach 20,000 feet in just over 5 minutes. The Mark XIII could carry bombs, rockets, or drop tanks for extended range missions. The airframe had been strengthened, the wings redesigned, the tail enlarged, the cockpit improved with better visibility and instruments. The landing gear was beefier to handle the increased weight. The fuel capacity was greater. Every system had been refined through 6 years of combat experience and engineering improvements. And then there was the Mark XVIII, entering service just as the war ended. This variant was specifically designed for operations in the Far East and featured even more strengthening additional fuel capacity and provisions for operating in tropical conditions. It was essentially a long-range, hard-hitting fighter bomber that happened to still be one of the best dogfighting aircraft in the world. But perhaps the most significant late-war variant was one that most people have never heard of, the Spitfire. Mark 28 represented a fundamental redesign of the aircraft. Stronger wings, completely new internal structure, more powerful Griffon engine, 5-blade propeller instead of the traditional 4-blade design. The Mark 21 was so different from earlier Spitfires that Supermarine considered giving it a different name entirely. The problem was that the Mark 21 arrived too late to see combat in World War II. The first production aircraft reached squadrons in January 1945, and by the time pilots were fully trained on the type, the war in Europe was over. The Mark 21 seemed destined to be a might have been, an advanced fighter that arrived after the war it was designed for had ended. That's when the Air Ministry made a decision that would determine the Spitfire's post-war fate. They ordered continued production and development of the Mark 21 and its derivatives while simultaneously ramping up jet fighter programs. The reasoning was practical. Jets were the future, yes, but they were expensive, fuel-hungry, mechanically complex, and still suffering from reliability issues. The early Meteors had a disturbing tendency to flame out during aggressive maneuvers. The engines required complete overhauls after just a few dozen hours of operation. The Spitfire, by contrast, was proven. Pilots knew how to fly it. Ground crews knew how to maintain it. The supply chain for parts and ammunition was already established, and most importantly, it was available immediately, in large numbers while jet production ramped up. So the RAF found itself in a peculiar position in 1946. They were simultaneously preparing for the jet age while maintaining and even improving their Spitfire fleet. The Mark 25 was followed by the Mark 25, which featured a bubble canopy for improved visibility. Then came the Mark 24, the final production variant, with further refinements and the ability to carry rockets or bombs for ground attack missions. The last Spitfire rolled off the production line at Supermarine South Marston factory on February 20th, 1948. Over 20,300 Spitfires of all marks had been built since 1938, making it one of the most produced British aircraft in history. And here's the remarkable part. Production didn't stop because the aircraft was obsolete. It stopped because the RAF had enough of them and factory capacity was needed for jet production. That final Spitfire, a Mark 24, was significantly more capable than early jet fighters in several important respects. Its range was better, its weapons load was greater, it could operate from rough fields that would have destroyed a jet's delicate engines, and in a turning fight below 20,000 feet, it could still outmaneuver most early jets. The Air Ministry's plan was to use Spitfires for ground attack, reconnaissance, and colonial policing, while jets handled high-altitude interception. It was a reasonable plan based on the strengths and limitations of both aircraft types, but events in the Middle East and Asia were about to prove that the Spitfire had more fight left in it than anyone expected. The post-war world was chaotic. European colonial empires were collapsing. New nations were emerging. Old conflicts that had been suppressed during the war were reigniting with fresh violence. And many of these conflicts required air power, but not necessarily the most advanced air power available. The RAF found itself conducting operations in Malaya, Kenya, Aden, Egypt, and Palestine. These weren't high-intensity conflicts against modern air forces. They were counterinsurgency operations, ground support missions, and reconnaissance flights over jungle and desert. Jets were overkill for these missions, too fast, too fuel-hungry, too delicate for rough field conditions. Spitfires, however, were perfect. They could carry bombs or rockets, loiter over target areas for extended periods, land on primitive airstrips, and be maintained by ground crews with basic tools. The Mark 18 became the workhorse of these operations, its tropical modifications proving invaluable in hot, humid climates. but it was in the Middle East that the Spitfire would prove it could still fight a real war against a modern opponent. And that story begins with the birth of Israel in 1948. When the British Mandate in Palestine ended on May 14, 1948, and Israel declared independence, 5 Arab nations immediately invaded. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq sent armies across the borders, confident they would crush the new Jewish state within weeks. The Israeli defense forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and desperately short of everything, including aircraft. The Israeli Air Force in May 1948 consisted of a handful of light civilian aircraft with machine guns bolted to them. Against them, Egypt deployed Spitfire Mark 9s and Hawker Furies. Syria had a few operational aircraft. The Arabs had complete air superiority, and they used it to strafe Israeli positions and bomb Tel Aviv. Israel needed fighters urgently, and they needed them from sources that wouldn't anger the United States or Soviet Union, both of which had arms embargoes in place. The solution came through a complicated web of arms dealers, sympathetic former RAF pilots, and Czechoslovakia, which was willing to sell weapons to anyone with money. Czechoslovakia had a small stockpile of ex-Luftwaffe Messerschmitt Bf 109s that they'd been maintaining after the war. These became Israel's first real fighters, delivered in pieces and assembled by mechanics who were learning as they went. But the 109s were worn out, mechanically unreliable, and difficult to maintain with limited spare parts. What Israel really wanted were Spitfires, and in one of the war's stranger ironies, they got them from the same source as their enemies, the British RAF. The RAF had surplus Spitfires sitting at bases across Europe and the Middle East. Some were being scrapped, others were being sold to foreign air forces. Through a combination of black market purchases, questionable transfers, and aircraft that mysteriously went missing from RAF inventory, both Israel and Egypt ended up flying Spitfires against each other. The first Israeli Spitfire arrived in September 1948, a Mark 9 purchased through Czechoslovakia. More followed through various channels, including aircraft bought from Czechoslovakia that had originally been supplied by Britain. By late 1948, Israel had assembled a squadron of Spitfires flown by a mix of Israeli pilots and foreign volunteers, many of them former RAF pilots who'd fought in World War II. The Egyptian Air Force, meanwhile, was operating Spitfire Mark 9s supplied directly by Britain before the arms embargo took effect. Egyptian pilots were trained, professional, and confident. They'd been bombing Israeli positions with impunity for months. On November 20, 1948, 4 Egyptian Spitfires were conducting a strafing run on Israeli positions near Beersheba. They'd made several passes, shot up some vehicles, and were climbing away when they were jumped by 2 Israeli Spitfires. The engagement that followed was surreal. Spitfire versus Spitfire, the same aircraft type that had fought together against the Luftwaffe, now trying to kill each other. The pilots on both sides had likely trained on the same RAF manuals, learned the same tactics, understood the same strengths and weaknesses of the aircraft. The fight came down to pilot skill and positioning. The Israeli pilots, both World War II veterans, knew every trick the Spitfire could perform. They split the Egyptian formation, isolated one aircraft, and shot it down. The Egyptian pilot bailed out over Israeli-held territory and was captured. It was the Israeli Air Force's first confirmed aerial victory, and it was achieved in an aircraft that the experts had declared obsolete 3 years earlier. Over the next several months, Israeli and Egyptian Spitfires would clash repeatedly. The Israelis shot down several Egyptian aircraft, including more Spitfires and C-47 transports. The Egyptians scored victories of their own. The air war over Palestine in 1948-49 proved that the Spitfire was still a lethal fighter in the hands of skilled pilots. But the most remarkable encounter came on January 7, 1949, and it involved aircraft that actually were supposed to make the Spitfire obsolete. 4 RAF Spitfire FR-18s from 208 Squadron were conducting a reconnaissance mission over the Sinai Peninsula, photographing Egyptian positions as part of intelligence gathering operations. Britain wasn't officially involved in the Arab-Israeli war, but they were monitoring the situation closely and providing intelligence support to Egypt, with whom they had treaty obligations. The Israeli Air Force detected the RAF Spitfires entering the area and scrambled fighters to intercept. But what took off weren't more Spitfires. They were Spitfires and Avia S-199s, the Czechoslovak-built Messerschmitts. The Israeli pilots had orders to drive off any aircraft violating Israeli airspace, which technically included the area where the RAF Spitfires were operating. The RAF pilots spotted the Israeli fighters and turned for the Egyptian border, but before they could reach safety, the Israelis attacked. In the confused engagement that followed, one RAF Spitfire was shot down, killing the pilot. The British government was furious. Israel was apologetic, but pointed out that the RAF aircraft had been violating their airspace. But that wasn't the engagement that made history. That came later the same day. 4 RAF Hawker Tempests from 6 Squadron took off from their base in the Suez Canal zone, tasked with finding the missing Spitfire and providing top cover for the search. The Tempest was a late-war design, more advanced than the Spitfire, with a powerful Sabre engine and heavy armament. RAF pilots were confident they could handle anything the Israelis sent up. What they didn't know was that Israeli radar had tracked their takeoff, and Israeli fighters were already climbing to intercept altitude. The Israelis sent up 2 Spitfires, flown by volunteer pilots who'd learned their trade over Germany and France. The engagement happened at about 10,000 feet over the Egyptian border. The RAF Tempests spotted the Israeli Spitfires and moved to engage, probably expecting to scatter them easily. Instead, they ran into pilots who were absolutely determined to protect Israeli airspace and weren't intimidated by RAF markings or superior aircraft. The dogfight was brief and brutal. The Israeli Spitfires used hit-and-run tactics, diving in for quick-firing passes, then climbing away before the Tempests could bring their superior speed to bear. One Tempest was hit and damaged, forced to break off and return to base trailing smoke. The others disengaged after realizing the Israeli pilots weren't backing down. No aircraft were shot down in this engagement, but the psychological impact was significant. RAF pilots had just been fought to a standstill by an Air Force flying obsolete fighters, many of which were worn-out surplus aircraft. The encounter forced a re-evaluation of what obsolete actually meant in combat conditions. The British government quietly ordered RAF aircraft to stay well clear of Israeli airspace for the remainder of the war. The incidents were hushed up and didn't become public knowledge until decades later, but within military aviation circles, the story spread. The Spitfire had gone toe-to-toe with more modern aircraft and held its own. The Arab-Israeli War ended with armistice agreements in 1949, but the Spitfire's combat career was far from over. The aircraft was about to prove itself in an entirely different kind of conflict, one that would demonstrate its versatility beyond what anyone expected. The Malayan emergency began in 1948 when communist insurgents launched a campaign to overthrow British colonial rule. The conflict would last 12 years and require a sustained counterinsurgency effort involving ground forces, intelligence operations, and air support. The RAF's initial response included Spitfires from several squadrons based in Singapore and Malaya. These weren't frontline air superiority fighters. They were Spitfire FR.18 variants configured for fighter reconnaissance and ground attack. The pilots flying them were peacetime RAF officers, many of whom had never seen combat. The operational environment was completely different from anything the Spitfire had been designed for. Malaya was dense jungle with few landmarks and weather that could change from clear to violent thunderstorms in minutes. The enemy didn't have an air force or significant anti-aircraft weapons. The challenge was finding small groups of insurgents hidden in jungle so thick you couldn't see the ground from above 1,000 feet. Spitfire pilots adapted to this new role by developing tactics that would have horrified their Battle of Britain predecessors. They flew low and slow, orbiting suspected insurgent positions while ground forces called in strikes. They learned to read the jungle, spotting disturbances in the canopy that might indicate camps or supply trails. They carried bombs and rockets instead of preparing for dogfights. The Spitfire's performance characteristics, which seemed obsolete compared to jets, were actually advantages in this environment. Jets were too fast to effectively search jungle terrain. They had to fly high to avoid obstacles, making visual reconnaissance difficult. Their fuel consumption meant limited time on station. The Spitfire could loiter for extended periods, make multiple attack runs on a single target, and operate from rough forward airstrips that jets couldn't use. One operation in 1949 illustrated the Spitfire's effectiveness in this role. British forces had tracked a large insurgent group to a valley in the Cameron Highlands. Ground assault was impossible due to the terrain. The solution was aerial bombardment using Spitfires carrying 250-pound bombs. 4 Spitfire FR.18s made repeated runs over the target area, dropping bombs and strafing with cannons. The pilots had to navigate through valleys, avoid hillsides obscured by clouds, and coordinate with ground observers who were marking targets with smoke. It was precision work that required complete trust in the aircraft's handling. The operation destroyed the insurgent camp and forced the survivors to scatter into the jungle, where ground forces could engage them. The success led to increased use of Spitfires for similar operations throughout the emergency. By 1951, jets were starting to replace Spitfires even in Malaya, but the transition revealed something interesting. The jets could fly faster and higher, but they weren't necessarily more effective at the actual mission. Ground commanders specifically requested Spitfire support for certain operations because the pilots could stay over the target longer and make more accurate attacks. The last RAF Spitfire combat mission in Malaya was flown on January 1, 1951, by 60 Squadron. It was a ground attack sortie against insurgent positions, the kind of mission that had become routine over 3 years of operations. The pilot later described it as unremarkable, which was exactly the point. The Spitfire had become so reliable, so well understood, that combat missions in it were routine. But while the RAF was retiring its Spitfires, other air forces were just beginning to discover the aircraft's capabilities, and some of the most unusual Spitfire operations were yet to come. The French Air Force acquired Spitfires after World War II and used them extensively in colonial conflicts in Indochina and North Africa. The Israelis continued operating Spitfires through the 1950s, gradually upgrading them with more powerful engines and modern avionics. The Indian Air Force used Spitfires during the 1947 conflict with Pakistan over Kashmir and kept them in service until 1957. But perhaps the strangest Spitfire operators were the air forces of Burma, Thailand and Syria, all of whom acquired war surplus aircraft and flew them well into the 1950s. These weren't prestige aircraft or museum pieces. They were working fighters, conducting border patrol, ground attack and reconnaissance missions because they were available, affordable and reliable. The Syrian Air Force flew Spitfire Mark 80s until 1953, when they were finally replaced by jets. Thai Spitfires served until 1955. Burmese Spitfires flew combat missions during internal conflicts as late as 1954. Each retirement marked the end of an era, but also proved that the aircraft's operational usefulness had far exceeded its design expectations. The last military Spitfires anywhere in the world were finally retired by the Irish Air Corps in 1961, 16 years after World War II ended and 12 years after jets supposedly made them obsolete. The Irish had acquired Spitfires in the late 1940s for air defence and kept flying them because they worked, required minimal maintenance, and were cheap to operate. When the Irish finally retired their last Spitfire, it marked the end of the aircraft's active military service. But the story doesn't end there, because the Spitfire had one more role to play. In the 1960s and 70s, as the aviation world became interested in preserving wartime aircraft, Spitfires started appearing at air shows and in private collections. Some were ex-military aircraft that had been stored and then restored. Others were cobbled together from spare parts, rebuilt in garages and hangars by enthusiasts who refused to let the design die. The Spitfire became the most popular warbird in the world, more sought after than Mustangs, more iconic than Hurricanes, more beloved than any other fighter of its era. Flying Spitfires became a cottage industry. Restoration projects took years and cost millions. Every airworthy Spitfire was treated like aviation royalty. And here's where the story comes full circle. Those restored Spitfires, flying at air shows in the 21st century, are often more capable than the aircraft that fought in 1940. Modern avionics, better materials, improved engines. The restoration community has continued the evolution that Supermarine started in 1936. A Spitfire flying today might have GPS navigation, modern radios, and engine management systems that would have seemed like science fiction to World War II pilots. The aircraft that was declared obsolete in 1945 is still flying in 2025, still drawing crowds, still inspiring people, still proving that great design transcends technological generations. There are approximately 60 airworthy Spitfires flying worldwide today, plus dozens more in museums and collections. Each one represents not just a piece of history, but a testament to the principle that excellence never truly becomes obsolete. It just finds new purposes. The jet age didn't kill the Spitfire. It couldn't, because the Spitfire was never just about speed or technology. It was about design elegance, handling qualities, and the intangible connection between pilot and machine that makes certain aircraft legendary. Modern fighter pilots who've flown both jets and restored Spitfires often describe the experience in similar terms. The Spitfire is harder to fly in some ways. No computer assistance, no fly-by-wire controls, no automated systems. But it's more rewarding because you're directly connected to the aircraft. Every control input provides immediate, honest feedback. You feel what the aircraft is doing in a way that modern jets, for all their capabilities, don't provide. That connection was what made the Spitfire effective in 1940. It's what kept it effective through 15 years of post-war service. And it's what makes it compelling today when people watch one fly at an air show. The story of how the Spitfire outlived its supposed obsolescence isn't really about the aircraft surviving through stubbornness or luck. It's about recognizing that obsolete is a context-dependent term. The Spitfire became obsolete for certain roles: high-altitude interception, high-speed combat against modern jets, but it remained superior for other roles that nobody had thought about when they declared it finished in 1945. It was better than early jets for ground attack in difficult terrain. It was more economical for air forces with limited budgets. It was more reliable for operations from rough airfields. It was easier to maintain with limited technical infrastructure, and in the hands of skilled pilots, it could still fight and win against aircraft that were theoretically superior. That's the real lesson. Technology doesn't advance in straight lines where new always equals better. It advances in waves, with different technologies being optimal for different purposes. The Spitfire found its post-war purposes and excelled at them for as long as those purposes existed. When the last military Spitfire was retired in 1961, it wasn't because the aircraft had finally worn out or broken down or proven unable to fly anymore. It was because the missions it had been performing were being eliminated or transformed in ways that required different capabilities. The aircraft itself was still functional, still capable, still ready to fly. Some of those retired military Spitfires were scrapped, their aluminum recycled for new purposes. Others ended up in storage, forgotten in hangars or government warehouses. A few became gate guardians at Air Force bases, mounted on pedestals as monuments, and a lucky handful were acquired by collectors who saw value in preservation. Those preserved Spitfires became the foundation of the warbird movement. As restoration techniques improved and interest grew, more Spitfires were returned to flying condition. Crashes that would have meant the end of an aircraft in military service became restoration projects. Parts were fabricated, systems rebuilt, engines overhauled. The Spitfire proved as resilient in preservation as it had been in combat. Today, a restored Spitfire can sell for over $5 million. Flight time costs thousands per hour. Insurance is astronomical. The complexity and expense of keeping them flying would have seemed absurd to the wartime RAF, which treated Spitfires as expendable weapons that could be replaced from factory production. But that expense reflects value, not just monetary value, but cultural and historical value. Each flying Spitfire is a connection to a generation that fought in circumstances we can barely imagine. They're not museum exhibits behind velvet ropes. They're living history, machines that still do what they were designed to do 70 years after they first flew. The sound of a Merlin engine is instantly recognizable to anyone who's heard it. That particular growl, rising to a snarl at full throttle, is like a voice from the past. When a Spitfire makes a low pass at an air show, when you can feel the sound in your chest and smell the exhaust, something connects across decades. The machine that saved Britain in 1940 is still here, still flying, still perfect. The engineers at Supermarine who designed the Spitfire in 1936 could never have imagined that their creation would still be flying nearly 90 years later. They were solving immediate problems: how to build a fighter that could match German aircraft, how to maximize performance with available engine technology, how to create an airframe that was both strong and light. They succeeded beyond what anyone expected, not just in creating an excellent fighter for 1940, but in creating a design so fundamentally sound that it could evolve through 15 years of military service and then continue flying for decades more as a preserved artifact. That's the final answer to the question of obsolescence. The Spitfire isn't obsolete because the fundamental qualities that made it excellent, the design elegance, the handling characteristics, the engineering excellence, are timeless. Those qualities don't become obsolete when new technologies emerge. They remain valuable in different contexts. The jet age didn't make the Spitfire irrelevant. It just changed the ways in which the Spitfire was relevant. And when military relevance finally ended, cultural relevance took over. The aircraft found new purposes and new reasons to continue flying. So when they said the Spitfire was obsolete in 1945, they were both right and wrong. Right that it was being superseded for certain specific roles. Wrong that its time was over. The Spitfire's time wasn't over. It was just changing. And 80 years later, the Spitfire is still here, still flying, still beautiful, still proving that excellence transcends any single era or purpose. That's how you outfly the jet age, not by being faster or more advanced, but by being so fundamentally excellent that people refuse to let you disappear. The Spitfire didn't survive through obsolete stubbornness. It survived because it was too good to let die. And as long as there are people willing to preserve these aircraft, willing to spend the money and time and effort to keep them flying, the Spitfire will continue to prove that some designs are truly timeless. The jet age came and went. The Spitfire remains. If stories like this one resonate with you, tales of legendary machines that refuse to fade away, innovations that defied their expiration dates, then you'll want to see what's coming next. This channel uncovers the forgotten chapters and unexpected afterlives of history's most iconic technology. Subscribe to make sure you catch them all. There's always another story worth telling.